Welcome to the Lowly Shepherd Podcast. I'll be your host, Pastor Jason Ravan, otherwise known as Pastor J. I'm a small-town pastor of a small-town church, and I love the Lord, and I love to read God's Word and just love to dig in and study. And that's really the intent behind this series, is getting to dig in to some of these passages and things that I'm studying as I'm preparing the sermons week to week. And so primarily, this series is intended for my church and for the local congregation and for friends and family and anybody else that might be interested in these things. I seriously doubt anybody else is going to listen to them. I don't have no aspirations of being some kind of national person, but really the goal and the intent behind this was to be able to dig into a lot of the stuff that really I'm just skimming the surface of when I mention it in passing in a Sunday morning service. Or the Sunday morning sermon. I'm just scratching the surface of a lot of things because, you have a limited window of time. And one of the blessings of being a full-time pastor is getting to spend all this dedicated time and effort and work in studying the Scripture and studying God's Word and being able to really dig into the languages and dig into the interconnections between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and chasing down some of the inferred references and some of the vantage points, the historical, social, economic sort of backgrounds and things that are going on. And I really enjoy getting to do that. It's one of the best parts of being a pastor, honestly, at least for me, is getting to really have that time to dig into dedicated study of God's Word. And so with that being said, I might spend, 20 to 25 hours just on the Sunday morning service every week in preparation, and then 10 to 15 hours in various times for the other messages that I give on Sunday night or during the Sunday school time or any other time throughout the week. And so in that, I don't get to expand a whole lot in a brief, although my congregation may not think it's very brief, a brief Sunday morning sermon that may be 35 to 45 minutes. There's a lot of stuff that I'm leaving out, trying to filter down to just one sort of main idea and really just kind of stay focused. I've been telling them for years, I still haven't managed it even after 12 years of being a pastor, trying to get, my goal is to get that sermon just laser focused down to 20 to 25 minutes. I've never quite managed that at all. Typically, my shorter ones are around 30 to 35 minutes, and my longer ones sometimes run 45 to 55 minutes. And I kind of tend to wander and chase rabbits, as I'm doing right now. But in all of that, I really would like to be able to expand upon some of the things that I touched on this past Sunday morning. And so, as I started this new series in the book of Hebrews this past Sunday, and as I told you guys on Sunday, I'm super excited about this. Hebrews is one of my favorite books. There's a ton of stuff in the book of Hebrews. And I'm sure many people know a few of the passages that are in there. They're familiar with the Word of God as like a sharp two-edged sword, or they're familiar with the roll call of faith of Hebrews 11, or now faith is the evidence of things unseen, the assurance of things hoped for. We're familiar with a few passages from the book of Hebrews, but I guarantee you most people have not really read through cover to cover, so to speak, sit down one sitting and read the book of Hebrews, which I would encourage you guys to do, because you have to remember every one of these books of the Bible were intended to be read, especially these letters, were intended to be read in one sitting. The chapters and the verse divisions that we see were added in the Middle Ages. They weren't in the original writings. And sometimes the chapter breaks, and even in our modern Bibles, they have sort of chapter headings that they'll list over the chapters or the sections to sort of tell you what that section is about. Sometimes those are a little misleading and kind of will throw you off the trail of what the passage is trying to say and what the original author is trying to convey through that, because we'll break it up into these nice little chunks that are not necessarily broken up the way they're supposed to be. And so I do encourage you to read all the way through the book of Hebrews if you can, in preparation for this sermon series, which will probably run us through the rest of this year at least, I would imagine, or at least into December. Because I really am looking forward to going verse by verse through this and showing you exactly what the author of Hebrews is telling us about how Jesus is greater than all of the whole old system, the old covenant, the old Hebraic system, the Levitical system, the sacrificial system. Jesus is greater than all of those things. and kind of culminates in chapter 2, how then are we going to escape the wrath of God if we neglect such a great salvation that's been offered to us? And so as we get prepared to get into the book of Hebrews in this sermon series, this past Sunday I sort of introduced this series with chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. And I really just kind of gave a brief, 5-minute introduction in talking about the authorship of the book of Hebrews. And so I wanted to spend more time talking about that because that's really one of the biggest mysteries about the book of Hebrews is who wrote it. Every other book of the New Testament, we're pretty sure we know who wrote them. I mean, Paul wrote all these letters, of course, we know that, and we even though their names aren't mentioned in the Gospels, we have very, very early traditions that assign the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to those Gospels to give us the evidence. And of course, John even has internal evidence that points to John being the author. And of course, Peter and the letters of John and James, etc. All these other letters give us, at least through church tradition or in the letters themselves, tell us who wrote them, but not the book of Hebrews. Hebrews is completely anonymous. And it's been a mystery even from the early church in the 2nd, 3rd centuries after Christ was resurrected and the church was founded. Even just within a couple of hundred years, people were asking the question, who wrote this book that's in the Bible, right? Who wrote this book of Hebrews? And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the possibilities for the authors. We just kind of briefly mentioned that in the sermon on Sunday. In the interest of time, but I really want to kind of dig into this just a little bit, and even this is not going to be a deep dive per se, but I just want to kind of point out some of the reasons why people and scholars have looked at these different options for the authorship. Now, from the earliest days, there has been a very close association of the book of Hebrews to the ministry of Paul the Apostle. And even in some of the King James versions, it'll say Paul's epistle or letter to the Hebrews. And that's been around, of course, since the Middle Ages when the King James was written. But that tradition has been carried down for almost 2,000 years, really, that Paul, or at least some influence of Paul, is being carried over through the book of Hebrews. And really, if you read the book of Hebrews, and if you spend any time reading some of Paul's major letters, especially the Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Colossians as well, if you read some of those letters of Paul, and then you were to immediately read the book of Hebrews, you would get some of that Pauline sort of feeling. There's a lot of themes. There's a lot of theology, there's a lot of even word choice sometimes, phrases and turns of phrases that seem very, very much like Paul. And some of the early church fathers saw that sort of connection as well. And so they said, okay, well, this must be Paul. And really it's only been in the last few hundred years where scholars have pretty much rejected that as a possibility for a number of reasons. Number one, the language that is used in the book of Hebrews is completely different from the language that Paul uses in his other letters. And we have a great selection. I mean, Paul wrote most of the New Testament. I mean, we have a great selection of Paul's letters and his word choice. That means the words that he uses, the phrases that he uses, the linguistic, the stylistic way that he writes the letters, or the letters are written through him. Because he did sometimes use a proxy that would write the letters for him. All of it is very, very different in the book of Hebrews than it was in his letters. And so that is kind of sends up a red flag for biblical scholars as they're looking at that, like, okay, well, you've got 10 letters over here that Paul wrote that all seem very, very similar to one another, and then you've got this one over here, Hebrews, that's completely different. Well, that sends up a red flag. Well, even beyond that, the level of sophistication of the Greek language in the book of Hebrews is way higher than what Paul is generally writing in his letters. If you're looking at sort of a scale, I've heard it said Mark, or especially like the letters of John, is a very low-level Greek, which makes sense, because if you've got John, for example, who was not necessarily a primarily Greek speaker, he probably spoke Aramaic or possibly some Hebrew, but most likely Aramaic as a natural speaker. Greek wouldn't have been his first language. And so it makes sense that if he's writing in Greek, it was a very, very sort of elementary school sort of level of Greek, which, the letters of John typically are written in. And then Mark can kind of follow, similar. In fact, when I was studying Greek, that was the Gospel of Mark was the first thing that we were studying as I was learning the Greek language in seminary, and also a very pretty low level elementary version of Greek. In a more on the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got Luke and the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, which is written in a very, very high, sophisticated level of Greek. Which is why a lot of people think Luke was a Gentile, a Greek-speaking native who was a physician, as mentioned in the book of Acts, but who would have been well-educated and was writing at a much higher level. The book of Hebrews is at that level, if not even higher, as far as its sophistication. I heard one guy compare it to, if you're looking at some of these levels of Greek, like John's letters or Mark, is kind of like, a sixth grade, writing, or maybe a high school term paper, as opposed to Shakespeare, this really elevated form of the English language, Shakespeare. And so Hebrews is Shakespeare of the New Testament. So it's written at a much higher level of sophistication, just the word usage, the rhetoric, the construction of the sentences, just a much more higher level intellectual sophistication of the book of Hebrews than in any of the letters in the New Testament. And so that's one reason why a lot of scholars say, okay, well, this can't be Paul. One suggestion has been that perhaps it is Paul in its content, but not in its actual writing. What I mean by that is some have suggested, and perhaps the book of Hebrews, or at least the primary section of the content until you get to the end, which is obviously a letter format, the primary context of the book, or the content of the book of Hebrews, is a sermon that Paul preached to a group of people. And as a pastor, as you read through the book of Hebrews, it does sort of feel like a sermon, and I could very well read it and see it as a sermon. And so that's a very real possibility. In this, and as this theory goes, then someone wrote down, either recollecting it or sort of transcribing it as it was happening, this sermon that Paul preached, and some have suggested perhaps it was Luke that wrote it down, being that higher, more sophisticated level of Greek that Luke writes in Luke in the book of Acts. In fact, my dean from seminary, the dean of theology, Dr. David Allen, wrote his doctoral dissertation on Luke's authorship of the book of Hebrews. Also wrote a pretty good commentary in the New American Commentary series on the book of Hebrews as well. So there's your promotion for that, Dr. Allen. But really good dissertation that he wrote, really comparing the word usage between Luke, Acts, because you had a whole rather large section of selection there to see the word choice and the word usage, and compared that with the word choice in the book of Hebrews and made some pretty strong arguments for that. And so some have suggested maybe that's a possibility. One of the main reasons, though, why it probably is not Paul, and as much as I want it to be Paul personally, because it does feel very like Paul in the content, but one of the reasons why I think maybe it's not Paul is if you look in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3, Hebrews 2, verse 3, it says, "How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard." Now, Paul was not one of the original 12 apostles, that's true, but Paul was one of the very first apostles after the resurrection of the Lord. That Damascus Road experience, and Paul makes it very clear all throughout the book of Acts and then the book of Galatians that he did not receive the gospel from one of the other apostles. He received it directly from the Lord in that Damascus Road experience and in his ministry as it goes beyond that. He made it very clear in Galatians that he didn't get it from Peter or James or John or any of these other guys. He got it from the Lord, making him, in a sense, a first-generation apostle, just like the other apostles. Even though he didn't follow Jesus during his ministry, he still was sort of counted in that first generation. The author of Hebrews here in verse 3 seems to like he's saying that he's not a first generation, he's a second generation, in that he has received it from the apostles. He's including himself in that category. Well, Paul certainly would not have fit that bill for that, and certainly this is a second generation person like a Timothy, for example, or Luke, for example, who would have been in that second category. And so that does seem to preclude Paul from being the author of the book of Hebrews. But, like I said, from the earliest days, there's been a very close association with Paul's ministry in this letter. So if it's not Paul himself, it is most likely someone that ran in the same circles, possibly a disciple of Paul, and that's why Luke is a very certainly a possibility there. Others have suggested Barnabas, the son of encouragement, and of course he is a Levite, as described in the book of Acts, and in the book of Hebrews, as we talked about Sunday, has a lot of Levitical priesthood sort of imagery in there. So Barnabas would be a very, very attractive candidate for being the author, but we just don't have a whole lot of information on that. We don't have any extant writings of his, at least directly in the New Testament. There is an epistle of Barnabas that's outside the Bible. It's not in the New Testament canon. But then there's some questions about whether that was really authored by Barnabas or if they just used his name, what's called pseudepigrapha, or false writings kind of idea, or using a false name. So it's kind of inconclusive in that way. Others have suggested Silas as a possibility. It certainly needs to be someone that had very good familiarity with the Levitical system in ancient Judaism, because they're interacting with these in a very, very high level. Certainly, it would seem unlikely that primarily a Gentile who did not grow up in the Jewish system would understand these things. So at the very least, a Hellenistic Jew, which is another reason why we probably rule Paul out. The book of Hebrews, when it's quoting the Old Testament, and it quotes the Old Testament more so than any other New Testament book. There's like dozens of Old Testament quotes in here. And when it does quote the Old Testament, it quotes it from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew. Now, the Septuagint was written probably 150, 200, 300 years before Jesus. So a couple of centuries before Jesus came along. The Septuagint was already around and had been revised even by that point. And that was the common Bible that the Jews used outside of Jerusalem. So if you were in Jerusalem, you lived in Jerusalem, you lived around Jerusalem in Israel, you were probably using the Hebrew Bible and spoke Hebrew and understood Hebrew. But if you grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, for example, or if you grew up in Asia Minor, or if you grew up in Rome as a Jew, even though you were still a Jew, you didn't speak Hebrew, you most likely spoke Greek. And that's what they're called, Hellenistic Jews. You'll see them in Acts chapter 6. That was actually the first deacons were commissioned because there was a fight rising up between the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenistic Jews about whose widows, were being neglected in the food distribution lines. And so they commissioned these deacons to take care of that. And so you've got the Hellenistic Jews, who were those Greek-speaking Jews that didn't grow up inside of Jerusalem, and then the Hebraic Jews, who probably looked down on them because they were speaking Hebrew and used the original Hebrew. But the Hellenistic Jews would have used the Septuagint. Well, the author of Hebrews is quoting directly from the Septuagint. Now, Paul doesn't do that. Paul, when he's quoting his letters, he's translating from the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. But it's kind of hard to explain to you, but in the book of Hebrews, this author is quoting directly from the Septuagint word for word. And so it's obvious that he's using the actual Greek Septuagint here, which Paul does not do. So that's another argument against Paul being the author of the book of Hebrews. One interesting suggestion that I've heard is that perhaps, and I believe it was Harnack that said this first back in the 1800s, that perhaps the author of the book of Hebrews was a woman. And that's why it's anonymous, because, the sort of stigma upon women writers and whatnot have even carried over into the last century, as far as not being as valued as men's opinions, etc., in the culture. And so this gentleman suggested, well, maybe there was a woman that wrote this, and he posited Priscilla as a possibility for this. Of course, she was a close follower of Paul, would have heard him preaching and talked with him. In fact, they worked together as tent makers. He with Priscilla and her husband Aquila for a number of years in Corinth, I believe it was. they worked together and would have talked with Paul and would have had all of these things for a number of years. And so that's a possibility theology-wise. Certainly she would have known Timothy, as is mentioned in chapter 13, would have run in those circles. And so sure, that could be a possibility, except for one major problem. And if you look in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, and it says here, and this is in the famous roll call of faith, and the author here says, "And what more shall I say, for time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets," etc. This is one of the few times, or it might be the only time, where the author actually refers to themselves, well, except for the us in chapter 2, I suppose, but as I or me, directly referencing themselves. And in the original Greek here, it's using a masculine form of these words, which means it's a man writing it, not a woman. So that precludes any woman, whether Priscilla or otherwise. So that leaves us with the final option. There could be a number of options, but the final main option that most scholars go with today is Apollos. And the reason they like Apollos as the possible sort of writer of the book of Hebrews is for a couple of reasons. Number one, he was well educated, very literate. He was a Hellenistic Jew. He grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, according to the book of Acts. And the book of Acts describes him as an eloquent man, well-spoken, well-trained in rhetoric and the ability to speak and make arguments, very well educated. And in fact, it was Priscilla and Aquila in the book of Acts that took him aside and taught him more fully and completely the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he became really sort of a rock star in the early church out in and around Paul's ministry, as Paul mentions him several times in the book of Corinthians, etc. And so he was a very well-spoken preacher, a very well-known personage in and around those communities and that ministry in the early church. One of the main reasons why scholars think he might be the author of the book of Hebrews is if you go through, and it's really kind of hard to describe, but the book of Hebrews is written in a certain style, which seems to follow the argumentative, rhetorical style of the ancient Jewish philosopher Philo. And Philo, of course, being, I believe he was also from Alexandria, Egypt, or at least from that region. Philo was well known as being a big-time philosopher, and he used a certain style of presenting arguments called rhetoric to win arguments and debates with other philosophers. Well, those that followed him and were disciples of him used that same sort of style. The book of Hebrews seems to follow that same sort of rhetorical style of Philo. And in fact, many of Philo's disciples were specifically called eloquent, using that same Greek word that is described of Apollos in the book of Acts, an eloquent man. And so some have suggested Apollos, being a disciple, so to speak, of Philo and his school of training in philosophy, is a good candidate for the authorship of the book of Hebrews. If you were to ask me my opinion, I would say, sure, that sounds good. I kind of go with, as I said on Sunday, Origen, when the early church father says, who wrote the book of Hebrews? Only God knows. There's a lot of reason to think that it was someone within Paul's original disciple group and his close-knit sort of group there. Apollos would certainly fit the bill, and I think there's a lot of reason to think Apollos was the author. But if you believe that it's Paul, I could find some arguments for that too. And like I said, personally, I want it to be Paul because I just feel like it has that sort of Paul flavor to it, even though it uses different words and different style. And so I like it's attractive to me, that sort of option about maybe it was a sermon of Paul's that someone, Luke, Apollos, or someone else wrote down and maybe even reformatted, maybe years later to write as a letter. Because it certainly does have that feel, but ultimately we don't know. But it is a great mystery. It's one of the bigger mysteries of the New Testament. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? And so it's interesting to get into that. Another element that I wanted to talk about is, who is the audience of the book of Hebrews? And we talked about on Sunday that It's obvious that they are Hellenistic Jews. They have to be, they're not Gentiles, they're definitely Jewish because we're dealing with a lot of Jewish stuff. Like I said, the book of Hebrews is steeped in Levitical thinking, in the book of Leviticus in particular. But it uses that sophisticated Greek, is using the Septuagint. So we're talking to Hellenistic Jews, probably obviously outside of Jerusalem. The statement in chapter 13 at the end, sort of the ending of the letter, where he's sending greetings, the author is sending greetings to others, he makes this statement at the very end where he says, those who come from Italy send you greetings. Grace and peace be with you. Those that come from Italy send you greetings, which seems to imply, just in the reading of it, that, hey, I've got a group of people from Italy saying hi to you where they came from. So it seems like the letter was being written to Italy, and, well, the primary city in Italy was Rome. And so some think that the audience was a group of Hebrew Jewish Christians, Hellenistic Jewish Christians, in the city of Rome that this letter was written to. One suggestion from one commentator I thought was really interesting was that perhaps this is not to a whole big category of Jewish Christians, but to one specific group. What we would call a small group or a house group, because if you remember, the early church grew up in house churches. They were churches that would meet in houses all around the city. And so it wasn't necessarily like one building that they would come to, because they didn't have churches like we have a church building today. They would meet in people's homes, and there would be multiple ones all as they grew all throughout the cities where the church was. And so one suggestion was that this was to a particular group in Rome, that was a particular house group that was perhaps starting to slide away from the Orthodox mainstream sort of thinking of the rest of the Roman Church that was taking place there. There's some thoughts there because, of course, later on it talks about do not forsake the gathering together of yourselves, as is the habit of some of you, is sort of the implication there. So perhaps they were pulling away from gathering with the other saints. They were sort of becoming a cult almost in themselves. Part of the problem that the book of Hebrews is addressing is this idea of this Jewish Christians sort of pulling back from following Christ, or at least they intellectually had accepted Christ, but they're starting to sort of apostatize and pull away from following Christ and sort of fall back into the old Jewish system, presumably by some persecution or some pressure, external pressure upon them. And so that's an interesting kind of theory, that perhaps this was just a small group, a particular group that this was being written to. And so I don't remember what commentary I read that in, but I did think that was sort of interesting. Well, as I come to a close here, I do want to spend just a few minutes talking about, at the end of the podcast today, because I do get people that ask me, where do I get some of this information? What's the best commentaries to use? I don't know how many of the commentaries I use are really necessarily for everyday use, but I do want to pull out a couple of them. And I do have compiled, if anyone's ever interested in, what is the best commentary on any given book of the Bible, I can probably tell you. I've done a lot of research on this. You can probably see some of the commentaries I have on my shelves behind me. This represents probably about a third of my actual collection of commentaries. I have probably 2/3 of my commentaries are digital format that I've accumulated over the years, for the last 20 years or so from seminary onward. And unfortunately, a lot of my books on Hebrew, so I can't really show them in this video or talk to you necessarily directly about this on the podcast, but most of my commentaries on the book of Hebrews that I use are actually in digital form, but I do have a couple here that I do want to show you. The first one is this. This is the New International Commentary Series. Really, this commentary series, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, is if you had to get one commentary series, this would be the one you would want to get. It is pretty technical, and so it's probably more than just sort of it's definitely more than a basic level, maybe even more than a mid sort of level, but it's not quite a high technical level that you get with some of the Word series or the New International Greek Testament series. But they're very readable, and even if you don't have the knowledge of the Greek or the Hebrew, or the languages and sort of the structures, and they're very easy to read and follow, even if you skim past some of those things. A lot of that technical information is in the footnotes that you don't necessarily have to read. This one is by F.F. Bruce. Now, this is one that was written, I believe it was originally written back in the 60s. F.F. Bruce, I believe, is even passed on now. I think there was a revised version. This is the revised version, actually, that was done. I think it was done in 2002. So it's still, even with the revised version, I think this one, is 20 plus years old. But this is still sort of the go-to for a lot of Bible scholars, a lot of pastors that like to use this series. There is a newer, updated version of this that's been done. I believe it was from 2012, and I think Gareth Cockrell is his name. And I don't have the physical of that. I do have the digital version of that one. Cockrell's is really, really good. As I was talking about Apollos and the rhetorical style of Philo, Gareth Cockrell's really spends a lot of time talking about that and the rhetorical argumentative style of the book of Hebrews. And so if you're interested in that, you're welcome to look at that. Really, though, on a more basic level, you can't go wrong with John MacArthur's New Testament commentary series. I have just about all of these. I might have all of these, either physically or in digital form now. There might be one or two I'm missing, but his book on Hebrews is excellent. Like I said, for a pastoral level, if you're preparing sermons for preaching, if you are even sitting in the pew, a congregation member, a layperson, these are very easy to read. Those of you that know me know I love John MacArthur. I don't agree with him 100% on every theological point, but I agree with him probably about 97-98% of the time on a lot of things that he says. And so he's got a lot of really good information, and he really goes in depth on a lot of things. And this was based off of a sermon series he did, and I want to say it was back in the 80s. So this commentary is pretty old in its content. It might have some more updated stuff in it, but I want to say this one's probably from the 80s. Let me just take a look real quick. Oh yeah, 1983. So I mean, this commentary is 40 years old, and so there are probably some newer information that's come up that this one's not going to have. But still, it's a good basic commentary for anybody that wants to use that. So if you're looking for a basic to a mid-level sort of commentary series, you can't go wrong with MacArthur's commentaries. They're really solid. He does have a one-volume commentary that kind of covers the whole Bible, and it's like that thick. But you're not getting a whole lot of information in that. It's basically sort of expanded footnotes that he has in his MacArthur Study Bible series. So any book of the Bible that you really want to get into, though, you definitely want to go into one of these. And there are a number of books, like I said, I don't have physically. I do have the digital versions of them. Peter O'Brien wrote a really, really good one on the book of Hebrews in the Pillar New Testament commentary series. Peter O'Brien has done some excellent work. His New Testament Greek, New International Greek version on Ephesians, I believe it was, is like the gold, or maybe it was Philippians, is the gold standard in commentaries. There is some plagiarism issues with him, unfortunately, that sort of kind of sidelined his commentary career, and unfortunately has made those books really hard to come by. The reason I have a digital copy is because I can't get my hands on a physical copy that doesn't cost $500 because they're rare now because of that, because the printers pulled those publishings. But there are a lot of really good commentaries. The NIV application series is actually a really, really good commentary series. I have about half and half digital and physical on those as well. And so if you're interested in digging deeper into the book of Hebrews and you're really interested in any of these commentaries, feel free to email me, thelowlyshepherd@gmail.com, and I'll, our text or message down at the bottom there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have on that. Well, that's probably all I have for today. I'm looking forward to next week as we get into how Jesus is greater than the angels in chapter 1, verses 4 through 14. I'm really looking forward to next week because I'm going to introduce you to a guy named Dr. Michael Heiser in a book that he wrote called The Unseen Realm that I'll kind of review for you next week. And just really kind of open my eyes to a whole new way of looking at things in the spiritual realm of things and how they connect the dots in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I'm looking forward to doing that with you next week as we talk about how Jesus is greater than the angels. But for now, I'm going to sign off, and so I will see you guys next time. Have a blessed day.